Hello everyone, good morning, good afternoon or good evening, whichever is applicable to you. Welcome to our webinar, Blockchain, Hype versus Reality. My name is Arie van Berkel, I'm a Senior Vice President and Group Director here at Lux Research, and I'll be moderating today's session. Presenting, or rather debating today, are my colleagues Anthony Schiavo, who's a Research Director, George Haslam, also a Research Director, and Sriram Ramanathan, Vice President and Group Director. So when I say we'll be debating, that's because we want to take stock of where blockchain is. I still remember back in 2014, blockchain was all the hype. People thought it was really important. It was like the foundation of Industry 4.0 or smart industry, as we used to call it. It's been 8 years. Where are we? We would like to show you all the arguments in favor of blockchain and against blockchain, and give you a reality check on where blockchain could be useful and where it could be less useful or maybe even detrimental. And in order to do that, we found that the format of a debate of some of our colleagues exchanging all the arguments is actually a great one. So that's what we'll be doing today. So without further ado, let's get started. If you have any questions, you can type those questions in the questions box on your screen, and we'll see if we can get to all of your questions. Usually we don't, but don't despair. We'll get to you back in email anyway. If you have any questions after the webinar, also don't hesitate, email them to us at questions@luxresearchinc.com. That's questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we'll be happy to respond to you. So we'll start our webinar. We'll show you a brief video explaining how blockchain works and what it actually is. And then our moderator for the debate, Sriram Ramanathan, will take over and guide you through the rest of our webinar. Thank you, and I'll see you at the end with the questions.
Ever since blockchain was first introduced to the marketplace in 2009, the topic has taken the world by fire. A single Bitcoin, the first cryptocurrency introduced to the market and built on top of blockchain, has skyrocketed in value from 8 cents in 2010 to around $65,000 in 2021 and approximately $40,000 today. Blockchain-based NFTs for digital artwork, such as the first 500 days, are selling for millions of dollars. All of this has led to the emergence of a whole generation of crypto millionaires and billionaires. What is blockchain? Simply put, it is a shared ledger to which transactions can only be appended if and only if it is approved by a majority of stakeholders. The core concept is not new. Many organizations mandate approvals from several accountants, stakeholders in their company for large financial expenses, thus ensuring that the chances of fraudulent transactions can be reduced. Blockchain works in a very similar fashion, except that accountants are replaced by computers and lines of code. Just as consequences can be disastrous for accountants who decide to cheat, likewise, blockchain raises stakes for participants who want to cheat by requiring them to put up some form of collateral. The key benefit is that the computers are significantly cheaper than accountants, which allows for a single shared truth in the broader marketplace, thereby enhancing trust, or, more correctly, semblance of trust in a marketplace. Today, the application of blockchain has gone beyond cryptocurrency to areas as diverse as product authentication, supply chain tracking, the circular economy, and cybersecurity.
Thank you, Ari. So, Josh, Anthony, how are you guys doing today?
Doing good.
Great. Thanks for having us.
So, well, thank you for your time, and I'm really excited about this debate. The reason is because, as you saw in the video, blockchain is on fire, and what we are trying to figure out is whether it's truly on fire or it's going to be another fire festival, right? So, with that, again, what we want to do is, first and foremost, I want to get your perspective on what, without, again, keeping your opinions out of this, why do you think people are finding this technology so fascinating? So, Josh, I'll hand it over to you. Maybe you can share your thoughts on this. And then after that, Anthony, of course, I'll come over to you.
Yeah. And so, for me, outside of the money that's entering the space and all the hype and interest around that, people making money, losing money, I am most fascinated about how blockchain can be used to sort of build and incentivize ways to connect data, build provenance, and in doing so, communicate to the world in a lot of different ways. So whether that is how to connect value to products, whether that is how to improve efficiency with identification of like a food safety issue or something like this. So anything that allows you to connect that provenance, directly to an inefficiency or value later in your chain, to me, that right now remains what I am most excited about when it comes to blockchain.
Got it. What about you, Anthony? Why do you think people are so gung-ho about this technology?
Blockchain, like every technology, comes with some philosophy baked in. Bitcoin emerged in sort of the aftermath of the post-financial crisis. And there's really a very strong sort of libertarian, anti-establishment philosophy. You see that in a lot of the claimed values of blockchain-based technologies. Things like they're decentralized or they're censorship resistant, they're trust-free. And we're facing a ton of challenges as society right now, whether that's climate change or recycling or even things like wealth inequality. And we're relying on big centralized institutions to tackle those, governments, corporations, the UN. So blockchain claims to be a way of organizing people and organizing our efforts that's sort of opposed to that philosophically. I think that's worth examining.
Got it. And so to kind of summarize, you're talking more about this idea of decentralization, this ability of, kind of moving away from these big institutions and taking care of these big problems with yourself. And what I feel is that, the point you're pointing to, Josh, right? Like this idea of sharing data in a trustworthy fashion. It's kind of like another side of that same coin, right? Like, only if there's data can these that you can actually make these decentralized decisions. You can operate in a decentralized fashion and not necessarily depend on the institutions itself. So I really see them as two sides of the same coin. So continuing on this debate, this is where we get to the heart of this whole discussion, this debate. I want to get your feel for, great, there's a lot of hype there, there's a lot of people are fascinated about this, but I want your opinions now as to what do you think about blockchain? So Anthony, let me start with you. What are your opinions on blockchain? And as you talk about it, give us concrete reasons about why you feel that way, along with some interesting examples that you have.
Ultimately, Shriram, I think blockchain fails in its own terms. And I think that philosophy is toxic as well. I want to start by drawing a distinction between public and private blockchains. A public blockchain is one where anyone can join. Anyone can be one of those accountants you showed in the video. And in those cases, cryptocurrency, whether that's Bitcoin or Ether or any other number of rewards, is used as a way to incentivize people's behavior. It's used to reward people for doing the actual computation necessary to operate these blockchains, but it's also used as a way to, maybe collateralize the individuals who are running these nodes and ensure that if they do bad behavior, they have something to lose. So what this means, Josh, you said that you're not as interested in the cryptocurrency side of the thing, but for these public blockchains, there's a fundamental link there between the cryptocurrency, this very speculative financial asset, and any real utility and decentralization and sort of the use of these public blockchains. And then there are private blockchains where a single organization or a set of trusted institutions control the nodes, and you don't have that anonymity, you don't have that availability to the public. But then you lose that benefit of decentralization. You see this in the Axie Infinity hack, where they operated a blockchain on a very small number of nodes, and that company being compromised led to the blockchain being compromised. So you have either to compromise on decentralization or tie into these very risky financial assets. And I think that promotes a lot of bad behavior. And then last, ultimately, the benefits of blockchain are really only true for data on the blockchain. And when you start trying to make these blockchains interact with the real world, things fall apart really quickly. What I mean by this is when we talk about the trust, the verification of data on the blockchain, that's really in the context of making sure people aren't doing fraudulent transactions or double counting, double spending. If you want to verify that data is being properly put into the blockchain, like from a real world, that the data in the blockchain really matches the real world, that's something you have to verify in the real world. So it doesn't solve a lot of the most fundamental trust-based issues.
Yeah, I'll get back to you on some of the points that you're making, but Josh, I want to hand it over to you. Where do you stand when it comes to blockchain itself?
Yeah, I think I'm a bit more neutral on blockchain. Mainly, so I think I'm a bit negative on most of the public blockchains, but I'm a bit more neutral and positive on blockchains that are either working towards becoming a hybrid, right, connecting nodes that are private in nature or have a select set of individuals that can add information, and then the private blockchains that are geared towards improving efficiency of a process that currently doesn't have a solution around it. So, what are some examples of things that fit that characteristic? The first is commodity trading. Is very inefficient currently to trade large amounts of commodities. Most of them are shipped, and the reality is that those ships stay in harbor for weeks at a time as accounts are migrated, as bill of ladings are acquired, as ownership is changed hands. And one thing I think we've learned is that blockchain through the use of smart contracts can actually reduce that time significantly, right? Rather than having to wait for those responses, individuals can input those nodes in a very short time. So when it goes for weeks, we go to days, which that's a lot of time when you think about using assets, setting the next shipment, right? Doing that. So when you're not making lots of small transactions, blockchain has some usability there. And I think we've seen that now as pilots, that started 2018 or so, have moved towards implementation now, starting around 2021 or so. So whether it's Comgo, Cavantis, others, we're seeing both energy and agro commodities begin to be traded here, and both transaction numbers as well as size of accounts are growing. So that is happening. That's just a fact, right? So blockchain is being used, and in those uses, it is being valued to some degree. So it's overcoming that hurdle. Is it the only way to do that? We're unclear, but it has a clear use case for that specific type of transaction, especially when you do that transaction within a narrow portion of the supply chain, right? We're not following it maybe from the field all the way to whatever end user. It's perhaps a middle component, and that's the part of the piece that they're applying that blockchain to. So that I think is a really good use case. And then the other one that I would point out that I think is really interesting is things around traceability and transparency, especially those that are aligned with food safety. So again, not connecting to a Bitcoin in this particular case, but connecting to improving overall efficiency. Can you identify quickly where a food safety challenge is and make that identification quickly? And again, change from weeks of identification to a day. This is again what we're seeing. We're seeing companies like Dole, for instance, begin to think about this, and they're not alone, right? The idea is, can you knock down that major pain point of identification and monitoring? And so it's not the classical use of blockchain that we've seen, right? To make cryptocurrency, to do that, they're more limited transactions to improve a bit of that improve upon a lot of that inefficiency, I think, that's noted for blockchain, and at the same time getting towards an interesting pain point while also aligning with what we're seeing become a more smarter, let's say, US FDA or EU food monitoring system. So those, I think, are some good examples, and that's why I'm more neutral on blockchain, because I think there are some use cases where exploring this technology and moving into implementation, there's just a good chance that they can be a tool within that box to improve the overall efficiency.
Yeah, and this whole commodity trading, this is a perfect time to talk about that, right? Like with all these challenges with logistics, these delays that are happening in the supply chain, and this is part of the reason why Maersk has been pretty much doubling down on that blockchain, because for them it's these international ships that are coming and sitting for weeks till customs is cleared or paperwork is done, and they themselves have invested a lot in blockchain just to get over that big hurdle you're talking about.
Well,
so
don't you think that this type of benefit can be done without blockchain? I mean, I definitely recognize that there's a lot of opportunity for digital technologies and better digital transparency in commodity trading. But with blockchain, you have a system that's very fundamentally hard to read and write to, particularly to write to. So if there's an error or if there's some deviation, ports are messy, these shipping is messy. If you get some kind of accidental transference or firing of a smart contract from one party to another that doesn't match in the real world, you've got no way to rewind that. So Josh, I mean, how much of these benefits, and I'm sorry for
no, it's a good question. It's a really good question.
How much of the benefit is from blockchain versus digital technologies? Because I'd argue it's really around the digital technologies.
So I think the reality is we're seeing both things happen simultaneously, right? To your point, is blockchain, a silver bullet by any means? The answer is exactly what you said. No, and companies are taking multiple approaches, right? So they're saying, blockchain is where we're starting, maybe because we have some partners that are, demonstrating that they have something set up, and currently perhaps in the infrastructure company, they have less of a complete digital solution where they can sort of have end-to-end tracking at this point. So this is the in-between step, I think, and that's why we're seeing some attraction. But the other thing, I think, I do think overcoming the speed of these transactions and efficiency is the thing that actually is driving companies to make a choice towards pilot and make a choice towards implementing. So even though I think there are some other options out there that require integration of multiple technologies, I think as far as taking the information you have and utilizing a blockchain to make that process more efficient, I think right now that is what is being attractive to this. It's moving to decrease some clear pain points, but perhaps doesn't have all the solutions. So Anthony, that would be my answer as far as why is this being implemented now. To your point, is it clear yet that these solutions are gonna be an excellent solution? I don't think so, and I don't think so because we're at the start of some of these non-characteristic use cases for blockchain. And so I think the fact that these companies are working towards thinking about how to utilize a blockchain perhaps outside of, let's say a financial incentivization structure associated with Bitcoin or any other blockchain out there, right? Those are fairly new use cases. And so, seeing how those work, this is the stage we're at. We're at doing those pilots. And I do think because they're overcoming those couple pain points that, that is attractive.
And I think I want to go back to this. First and foremost, to your point, it's still an emerging technology. Like bulk of that application has been, or rather effort has been directed towards cryptocurrencies. I think cryptocurrencies, because it's financial, that idea of how to create that incentive is very clear. It's less clear when it comes to these like supply chain logistics kind of applications. That's number one. So, and like any emerging technology, it takes some time to figure out what those use cases are, not only what the use cases are, but how to deploy those specific use cases. But I do want to go back to the other point you were mentioning about, not being able to delete data, right? And then that leading to a lot of interesting hacks and stuff like that. I think being able to delete or not being able to delete that data or correct that data is a double-edged sword. In some cases, the ability to delete that data has led to the biggest scams in the world, right? Like, accounting firms shredding paperwork and stuff. And in some cases, I totally agree with you. But the scams you're talking about, you were talking about the public versus private blockchains. I think there is like this in-between thing. So the public blockchains you're talking about is like everybody's participating. And there you clearly not being able to delete data has led to these massive hacks. Now you come to the private blockchain, you gave this example of this hack where there were like 8 computers or 8 servers and 50% of them got owned. But I'm thinking about that intermediate scenario that Josh was mentioning, especially related to commodity trading, right? Where you have, I don't know how many people are involved in commodity trading, but you're talking about like 50, 100 stakeholders who are like kind of interacting with each other, which falls somewhere between this tiny set of private people who all trust each other, and at the other extreme, which is like public. And I personally feel that is the place where the value of blockchain gets maximized. That's the place where I think implementing blockchain is going to be very interesting. So that's point number one. And I'll hand it over to you in a minute. But the second piece, I think you talk. So I think overall, from an efficiency perspective, it's in these kinds of situations where I think it play a role. But I don't know what your thoughts are, Anthony, with regards to that.
I think what is unique about blockchain is the incentive structures it creates, right? If you're just talking about blockchain as a pure data architecture without the concepts of rewards for good behavior, then to me, it's really just a more inefficient way to store data, right? And it's fundamental within the nature, even these more efficient blockchains, like Solana, you're still doing a lot of redundant cryptography, right, to store the data. And for the mid-sized scenarios that you're talking about, we already have systems in place to, to manage those trust and to manage those types of sets of stakeholders and their interactions. I mean, look at the London Metals Exchange. This is a system that's worked for a long time. Now, it's not perfect. We just recently saw the London Metals Exchange roll back essentially 3 days of trading in more or less vanish.
I'm gonna interject. LIBOR is a system that has existed for like decades, and we know there was a big scandal around it.
Yeah, there's a big scandal.
And that's the problem. That's the problem. Like they were calling up each other on
blockchain is not a solution.
It could have solved it. I think it could have solved it because everything is recorded. You couldn't have deleted the data, right? But anyway, I'll hand back to you.
The way we found records of the LIBOR scandal, right? Like the way that people, if you look at SEC investigations, the way they do and the way they catch people is because they text their buddies or they Slack their coworkers and they say, "Yo, I'm doing some crimes," right? Maybe not in as many words, but that's the way they catch them, right? The idea that, and in a very similar way, the way that these blockchains get hacked is not by brute forcing, through ownership of the nodes. It's by social engineering outside the blockchain itself. That's the real challenge. The thing about blockchains to me is not that they solve the social engineering issue, but that they're uniquely vulnerable to these social engineering issues, because once you make those changes, once you steal someone's, Bitcoins, or you falsely activate a smart contract, the amount of recourse you have is limited. So to me, you're still going to have people doing the social engineering and the scams, and blockchain, as a space is rife with scams. So it's really, I don't see the evidence. You say, oh, blockchain can increase trust, blockchain can improve security, improve these systems, but all the evidence we have is that blockchain is, the actual space is rife with these types of schemes and scams. So, I just can't buy into this idea that we're gonna do innovation that's 99% scams for years, and then at some point it'll become good.
I'll point back again. So again, the reason I think I'm neutral is is less about even necessarily these saying you're going to build trust, but it's actually overcoming key pain points. Again, the timeline to do a transaction. Currently, using existing methods that you're talking about, right? There's a key pain point right there. That takes a long time to do those, to pass those contracts and pass ownership. And the same happens with food safety. It takes a long time to identify those things. And so these are again, this is why I like the idea of provenance. This is why I like the idea of adding, things to traceability that are aligned with key pain points rather than just aligned with saying that trust equals value. Because I agree with you. I think there's a lot of challenges still, with trust, but I do think that we're seeing some non-conventional uses of blockchain that do overcome some interesting pain points, and those are the things that people should focus on. And if I were, more thinking about investing money into blockchain, those are the types of use cases that I'd be focused on, rather than saying, let's connect some other form of an incentivization and get into these more skeptic-driven, right, type of financial challenges that we see blockchain really struggle.
Speculative.
Yeah, speculative.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the issues we are talking about, both the points you're bringing up, Josh, and Anthony, the points you're bringing up in terms of why you're skeptical about blockchain. We captured a lot of those things in this decision-making framework that we built, I think it was 4 years ago already. So, and I think we still, at least I still believe in this framework. It's a pretty robust framework. 4 years, I don't think I would change anything on this framework, maybe minor tweaks. But a lot of stuff you talked about, right? You talked about the incentive structure, which really I talk about whether the power is distributed not, uniformly the network or not. Or we talked about this, the physical, the disconnect between the physical world and the data that's actually on the blockchain, which is really captured in whether the raw data is being collected in a automated fashion and in a tamper-proof fashion and so on. What was interesting was when we applied this framework, we found that about 60% of the pilots that were being done across multiple industries, power industry and agriculture, we basically predicted they're all bound to fail. And we have seen a lot of those failures kind of play out over the last 4 years. And to me, that's very interesting. That kind of supports your argument, right? Anthony, that, hey, there's very, very little use for blockchain. I personally believe the big issue is that, if you look at the number of nodes on this, there's a very, very tiny, narrow window of applications where blockchain will truly be valuable. But I want to invite both of you to comment on this framework, what you think from the perspective of some of the use cases that are being implemented in your industry. And maybe you can talk about some of those use cases where blockchain is going to be valuable, you really see the value. So I'll hand it to you, Anthony. Why don't you start off, tell us a little bit about this and where you see potential value in the future looking at this framework.
Yeah, I actually do think this framework has a lot of value. Even though I'm a blockchain hater, right? I think this framework, there's a lot to be said for it. The areas where we see in my space, the chemicals industry, the most interest are definitely around credits and credit trading. So that could be carbon credits, that's a bit more mature, but potentially in the future, plastic waste credits, and plastic waste management. And I think there's some really interesting arguments to be made in favor of blockchain-based technologies here. On the actual credit side, you have some level of fungibility when you think about, well, we're removing a ton of carbon, or we're cleaning up a ton of plastic waste, we're recycling a ton of plastic waste. But in both those cases, there's obviously a lot of data and sort of metadata associated with that ton of material, whether that's the type of carbon capture, because there's some are really great and some are really bad, the kind of plastic you're talking about. So there's a lot of really interesting things there. And, I think the goal is ultimately to incentivize people to do something, make something more financially profitable. And that's the one lever, that's the one thing I think blockchains are good at is creating those kind of financial incentives, right? Much more so than creating trust in a system. I think the challenge when you look at the carbon credits market is there's been about 21 million tons of carbon credits that have ended up tokenized already. It's relatively mature, certainly compared to plastics. And the challenge is that that influx of money, it didn't fix any of the fundamental problems with those markets. So a lot of those low quality credits got absorbed by this money. And a lot of the money was basically funneled to the bad actors. So it's interesting, but you need good power structures, you need good markets outside of blockchain, and it really can't fix those problems.
It's interesting. I like the way you're thinking about this as a tool to actually distribute the incentives or democratize the incentives, if I can call it, or decentralize it, or whatever you want to call it. But I'm going to hand it over to you, Josh, in a minute. But you have to, like, when you talk about incentives, if somebody is offering me an incentive, I have to trust that next person, that person is actually really, I can trust them to give that incentive to me, right? Like it's a promise, but that promise, and I think in that sense that blockchain allows you to distribute those incentives, but also bring in trust in the fact that I will get that incentive if I do something. So I don't know, Josh, I'll hand it over to you. Looking at that framework, looking at that, at those, what do you think in terms of agri-food? What's promising, and what is interesting from your sector?
If you actually go back to the figure for just 1 second,
absolutely.
I brought up, I think, a point onward, and perhaps the one area where I think this, framework could use a small tweak that I think is about sort of use cases is in that upper right corner where it's, is power distributed uniformly in the network? And I don't know if I use maybe the term power is the wrong, but responsibility. I think, again, this comes back to, in order to, so Anthony, I think you were bringing up carbon credits, right? And the only way to prevent whether or not bad carbon credits enter your system is whether you have a responsible set of validators, as a part of that system, right? And that physical world gets linked somehow into this blockchain, so that anything on this right now has credibility tied to it. Without that credibility, you do exactly what you said, and it doesn't matter. Like, all you're doing is incentivizing bad actors, right? Because it's just like, hey, we want to make money for these carbon credits. So I think the tweak I would make is, is power uniformly distributed? I'm not sure. I think that might be one of the challenges for blockchain, actually, is that power is in some cases uniformly distributed. And I think this idea of considering, either if you're not, in this private blockchain, right, where you're controlling everything, which I think is going to be common still, right, because of how blockchain is used and where most of that money is getting funneled, there needs to be an idea that, well, power can't necessarily be uniformly distributed, because if it is, that means you're probably losing some of your credibility, because there needs to be some actors who have more responsibility in creating credibility at particular nodes of importance. So that's something maybe to consider in this, as we think, how do we move from blockchain being tied to the scams, to skepticism overall, to just bad actors and making some rich, to an actual tool, right, that has trustworthiness tied to it? Because again, I think I've said this before, but it's not that you need to create trust, it's that you need to become trustworthy, right? That we need to share and establish that. And I don't think what blockchain's set up for, unless it's in a private network, that's really possible today. And so unless you don't have power distributed uniformly, so perhaps I would create a shunt in that top right corner that still comes down, and that you have a way to create credibility through sharing that might be an interesting way to create more opportunities for blockchain, actually.
So
yeah,
Anthony, this is where I would inject a little more skepticism.
Go ahead.
I would inject a little more skepticism here, because to me, in any real world system, in any physical system, you are always going to have power distributed non-uniformly, right? You're always going to have physical system. The real world is subject to things like governments and regulations, right? There's very, very few real world systems where there is no government, there is no regulation, and basically it's the high seas. I mean, there are literally parts of the ocean that are effectively lawless, and it's no surprise that you have commodity traders, doing some pretty sus stuff out on the open ocean. So, to me, as we get into any of these, whether it's carbon credits or any of these possible use cases where Bitcoin or blockchains, I should really say, blockchain-based systems can drive outcomes, can incentivize outcomes, there's a recognition that there's always going to be these powers that exist in these real-world systems. So maybe those powers want to utilize blockchain-based systems. I don't think they need to, though. I don't think it's necessary. And I think they invite a lot of potential bad outcomes when they do bring in blockchains. So that's a big part of my skepticism.
And I think I do understand your point on Josh about like maybe you don't need the power distributed evenly. And then Anthony, your point is absolutely right. You will never have like a system where the power is completely uniformly distributed is like very hypothetical. But I think there is that maybe that question is not posed correctly. It's not about power. It's about having that incentive structure distributed in a fashion so that it reflects how the power is distributed in that network, right? Like, and I don't have the answer to that, but I think there's that interesting angle.
You're saying incentives to create good behavior, right? And
exactly.
And I think
so
it's
now
interesting.
whether that incentive is like the more powerful actor has more power to make decisions or alternatively has less power to make decisions, I think that depends on use case to use case, frankly. Depends on.
Well, again, I think the power thing, perhaps I think the word that I don't like there is power. Not that power is important, but again, I think it's about credibility, right? Do you have a standard that, and standard and let's say the experience in doing that, right? That your information is trusted. That is different, I think, than power. Power, right? You can purchase, however much power you want in a lot of cases,
right.
And that does exactly what we were talking about, which is, create lots of opportunities for any type of bad actor. But instead, the term should be more around thinking about how to lend credibility. Now, again, do you need to do that with blockchain? I don't necessarily think so, right? We see the existing voluntary carbon markets moving forward, and that creating trustworthiness is happening through working with these trusted third-party auditors and trusted standards, and those standards are getting better and better and better. So how does blockchain, is there a pain point there? Like I was talking about for those transactions where you're really shortening times or something like this, I don't know. I don't see that clear pain point here yet, because the way I understand, a lot of carbon markets these days, for instance, is that there's still a lot of hand holding that needs to happen. So going into a blockchain doesn't decrease that. So again, you need to identify whether or not there's a clear pain point. And I think in a lot of cases there might not be a clear pain point still. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, but plus two things to wrap that up, right? Like one is, I think to Anthony's point, you were talking about those pain points and the efficiency. To Anthony's point, a lot of that could be done with a regular database. Like you may not need a blockchain in many situations. So that's one. And the second piece is like to really unleash the power. I think there is that gap that again Anthony pointed out in terms of physical data is completely divorced from that data on the blockchain. And so we need to bring other suite of technologies together, right? Like palm oil tracking, right? Like which you have talked about, which we have discussed before. It is interesting. Like, can you use satellite images to figure out, like, are people cutting down trees to grow, to produce that palm oil? Right now, it's not happening. Right now, it's like a human being entering it, which is a weak link. Before I hand it over to Ari, and before we wrap this up, I'm going to throw one question, maybe a quick yes or no. If you guys had $10 million, how would you invest part of it in blockchain? And if so, what percentage of that would you put in blockchain? Anthony?
No.
Okay.
Not under any circumstances.
What about you, Josh?
No, not right now. There's too many other things that I think are better places to put money right now for me.
Okay.
At least in the food and ag sector. There's just too many other bigger opportunities out there.
Okay. All right, Ari, I will welcome you back to the webinar. Please go ahead.
All right, so thank you all very much for this very lively debate and exchange of many arguments. I think my key takeaways here is, first of all, blockchain is about decentralization. And it's good to remember that because there are multiple examples where decentralization isn't really an option, where things are centralized by nature. In my own environment, the power grid is centralized. You cannot change that. It's just the one cable getting into your home. Technology has reduced inefficiencies. So blockchain is getting better, but it's still using a lot of energy. And that's something that we need to reckon with. And the connection to the physical world is also an issue. And finally, we introduced a framework that can help clients decide whether blockchain would actually be a benefit and provide an advantage here. So that's the very rough summary of many arguments we exchanged. Let me finish off by posing a couple of questions. We've seen quite a few questions appear already. There's a lively debate going on while you were debating. Our listeners were also debating. So I've got at least two questions that I would like to put in front of you. One is about that connection to the physical world. And I think Anthony made the point that if you put wrong data in the blockchain, it's actually more of a bother than otherwise, because it's very hard to get rid of the wrong data. And of course, the weak link there is the connection to the physical world, where some person presumably is typing a lot of information into something before it goes into the blockchain. And that person may either intentionally or unintentionally make mistakes, of course. Do you guys see any developments that would make that connection between blockchain and the physical world smoother and more robust?
I can take that up and then feel free to jump in, Josh, Anthony. So we are seeing a slew of other technologies that are coming in that are automatically collecting data. So one of them, for example, there's this company called Everledger that is actually tracks diamonds on blockchain to make sure that they're not conflict diamonds. And what they do is they use computer vision to kind of take a picture of the diamond, and they identify about 40 different metadata points associated with that diamond, like what's the color at which it reflects light, or how much light gets reflected and so on. And that gets built into the blockchain right in the beginning of the supply chain, as soon as that diamond enters the supply chain. They do the same thing for art, fine wine. I think the other piece is we have come across these interesting companies that make these markers, like chemical markers that you could effectively add to anything, to food products, to plastics, and then you can scan those markers and then record them on the blockchain. So Anthony, Josh, I don't know if you guys have any comments on that.
You know, BASF's Recichain project basically combined a physical watermark they were putting in plastics to make them detectable, more easily machine detectable, with a blockchain-based system that would record who owned those plastics, right? So they were combining their sort of an advance on the physical side, but an advance on the digital side. But the note of caution I would inject here is there are a lot of physical systems where things can change. Big one being carbon credits. You know, the carbon can burn. It's one of the big uses of carbon, actually. And so when those carbon, you know, if a forest burns down, you know, those carbon credits get revoked, and that can be very difficult to do on a blockchain-based system. So, you know, it's not just about recording and detecting it at the time, accurately at the time. It's about making sure you have a system in place to manage all the possibilities.
Yeah, and I would agree. You know, if you're definitely relying solely on a blockchain, you know, that can definitely be an issue. But you know, I will say, you know, at least for agriculture, satellite imagery has really come a long way to identifying practices and how to connect your system, your growers, right, independent of whether or not you're vertically or horizontally integrated, to monitor the things that matter to you, the things that you want to include in the blockchain, right? So whether or not maybe companies are doing cover cropping and other things that are associated with carbon credits, right? And developing those scope 3 type carbon credits. Those are interesting areas. Now, is that information fluidly, are we capable of fluidly adding that to a blockchain yet with some real understanding and certification of that information ongoing? I think we have a little bit to go. I think we're getting there where our models are ready and available, and we're able to extract the right information better and better and better. But I think for now, that information is best suited to more conventional digital data infrastructures and sort of communicating internally. So that's where I think we're at. So that technology is improving, but not quite ready for that automated look that both Anthony and Sriram, you kind of brought up.
All right, thank you. I think we have time for one more question with a somewhat shorter answer, hopefully, but I think it's an interesting aspect. We've discussed blockchain and how it can improve efficiency. So now it's a typical digital application where efficiency is at stake. But there may be another argument for blockchain, which is you actually add value by creating the transparency. For example, in a CPG value chain through tracking and tracing. Do you think there's an added value to the use of blockchain? So something extra other than just making things more efficient, if blockchain does so to begin with, and I heard your arguments about that.
Yeah, let me just jump in here quick. I think there's a number of companies working on this type of idea and saying, hey, we're going to connect whatever supply chain to a higher value market by connecting your practices and how you grow something, for instance. What I've seen so far, though, is that there's still quite a cost associated with blockchain, and there has been really no, outside of what Sriram brought up with diamonds and really high value something, right? that where it's really important to perhaps track the provenance, but for something that is lower cost and you have more of those being produced, I think the reality is that additional value, specifically from blockchain, hasn't been satisfied, which is why we're seeing companies pilot both conventional ledger platforms as well as blockchain, because we're still trying to assess. So we're still at the pilot phase there and waiting for results.
All right, so thank you very much, Josh, Anthony, Sriram. This concludes our webinar for today. Again, if we didn't get around, we only got around to 2 questions. If we didn't get around to your question, we'll get back to you in the email. If you have more questions, just send them to questions@luxresearchinc.com. Check out our upcoming webinars, highly recommended, of course. Especially our sustainability debate is I think worth watching very much, and you'll see some of the stars of today's webinar there again. You'll be getting a survey right after this webinar. We'd appreciate it if you filled it out so we can get some feedback and see how useful this was to you, and if you have any suggestions how we can improve later on. And we'll of course be distributing to all attendees the slides and the recording. So thank you very much. Thank you for watching, and see you in our next webinar.